Hi, so we're going to talk about restructuring or reshaping your data. We're going to start with pivot wider or moving from a longer format to a wider format. Let's go ahead and open up some of the sample data sets that we have here. I'm going to go into the Reshape directory and I'm going to go into wider. And the first data set I'm going to pick up is reshape one column. So we'll start with a single column, a data set with a single column that we want to reshape. So here you have height measurements of different subjects. Each person or subject is identified by the ID column. So the first person is a female, and I've measured their height at time 1. I've measured the height at time 2, time 3, and time 4. Then for the second person, you've measured height for that person at 4 different times, and the height measure is stored in the height column. So I'm going to start simple. Let's go under datasets and go under reshape and go under wider. Okay, so what we want now is we want to capture the height in a single variable. And let's take a look at what it looks like. Uh, and what I meant is we want to capture the height at each time in a single variable. Okay, so let's enter the name of the data set. Let's call it test1. And the variable name for the repeated factor, that happens to be time. Remember, I'm measuring height at 4 different times, so time has my repeated factor. And if you remember, the values for time were 1, 2, 3, 4, which were repeated. And the variable name that had the values, so the measure was height, so the variable that contained the height measure was height. Okay, so fairly straightforward. There's one thing I want to mention is by default, all other dataset columns except the repeated factor or the value or the variable that contains the value, except these two columns, all the other columns will be used to identify each observation. Okay, so right now I know I only need ID to identify every observation. But in this case, adding gender doesn't hurt. So by default, it's going to use both ID and gender to identify every observation. And having gender extra doesn't hurt at all. In fact, it helps in one important way is that in my reshape data, I do have the gender of each person correctly reflected. Okay, now here I have a single variable for that captures height at time 1 for every subject, height at time 2 for every subject, height at time 3 for every subject, and height at time 4 for every subject. And I've got the gender as well. Now, if for instance in the resulting data set you don't want to capture gender, you can do that as well. Let's go back to the reshape. And obviously, let me go back to the data set. You see the time the time is the repeated factor. So I've got time at 1, 2, 3, and 4, 4 different intervals, which I've measured height. This is the original data set. And now I'm going to reshape it so that I don't have gender in my resulting data set. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I am going to say identify my variables by ID. And I'm going to create test2. And when you see the results, you will have the ID or the height at time 1 for each subject, the height at time 2 for the subject, the height at time 3 for the subject, and gender is no longer in the data set because we specified that we only want to identify each observation by ID. Okay, so that was a fairly straightforward example. Let's go and make it a little complicated by now introducing multiple measures. at each of those times. All right, so let's look at the data set again. For each subject, you've got the gender, and at time one, you've got height, but you don't only have height, you have weight, blood sugar, and triglycerides. Okay, time two, you have height, weight, blood sugar, and triglycerides. All right, so when we want to reshape this from long to wide, so we want a single variable for height at time 1, 2, 3, or rather you want a single variable for height at time 1, a single variable for height at time 2, a single variable for height at time 3, and a single variable for height at time 4. In the same way, you want a single variable for weight at time 1, and another variable for weight at time 2, and another variable for weight at time 3, and another variable for weight at time 4, and so on. The same for blood sugar and triglycerides. So let's go under data sets and let's go into reshape and let's go wider. Again, I'm going to save it into test 3. That's the new data set to save my results. Enter variable names for repeated factor. Now I have time again as my repeated factor, and the measures that I am taking, or the values for height, weight, blood sugar, and triglycerides that are measured at 4 different times for each subject, are stored in the height, weight, blood sugar, and triglycerides column. And I will go ahead and run that. And here you see that I've gone wider. I've got one variable for height at time 1 for each subject, one variable for height at time 2 for each subject, one for time 3. In the same way, moving to the right, I have one variable for weight at time 1, one variable for weight at time 2, and one variable for blood sugar at time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, and so on. All right. Let's go ahead and make it a little more complicated and open up another data set which has measurements across 2 different time variables. Okay, so here I've got for each subject, and the subject ID is here. I've measured blood sugar, sodium, and calcium on week 1, day 1, week 1, day 2, week 1, day 3, week 1, day 4. So it's not only that the measurements are taken with one factor, there are 2 factors at play. I have week and I have day. Okay, so for every week, I'm making these measurements at 7 different days, 7 days of the week. Week 2, I take these measurements at 7 different days. And what am I measuring? I'm measuring blood sugar, sodium, and calcium for each subject across, as you would expect. In this case, it is 4 weeks, and I'm measuring on each day for each of the subjects. I am measuring the blood sugar, sodium, and calcium. In the data set, we're doing this for 4 weeks, and there are 2 subjects involved in this data set. So the first subject has an ID of 101, and the second subject has an ID of 102. So again, I want to reshape it and make it wider. So I will have a single variable for blood sugar on week 1, day 1, another variable for blood sugar on week 1, day 2, another variable for blood sugar at week 1, day 3, and so on. Okay, for all 4 weeks and for all 7 days for each of those 4 weeks. I will end up with a lot of variables, but I just want to show you that it can very easily be done. I'm going wider now again, and I want my data set to be test 4 here. And here I've got week and day, because there are 2 repeated factors, and I have got blood sugar, sodium, and calcium, okay, which contains the measurements on each of these intervals. And let me go ahead and run. And as soon as I do that, you can see, if I go into the variable view, is that I've got a single variable for blood sugar week 1, day 1, week 1, day 2, week 1, day 3, all the way up to week 4, day 7. Okay, so I've got all these extra variables that contain the values for the blood sugar for that week and that day. And not only blood sugar, I've got the same for sodium and calcium. Okay, so that shows you how I have effectively gone wider. There's one more thing I want to show you really quickly here, and that is I have the ability to specify the variable to use as a separator. Okay, so if I didn't make that clear earlier on, in all these data sets, it's the underscore here that separates height at time 1, height at time 2, height at time 3, height at time 4. That's the underscore that is the separator. Now, if I want to choose a different separator, I certainly can go ahead and do that, and that's what I specify here. In this case, I'm going to do dot. I'm going to call this test 5, and with that, I can run it. And here you see the dot is the separator between the week and the day. So that's important for you to understand that there is a separator that allows you to separate the measure and see the interval and the interval associated with the measure. Okay. So that covers Reshape wide. Definitely watch the next video where we talk about reshaping from wide to long. Okay, and many of you will probably want the long format for repeated measures ANOVA. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending, and definitely tune into the next video where we show you how to restructure from wide to long.